Welcome to Bibliophilia. Today we're discussing Jane Eyre. So that's our theme music. This is our first time with theme music, which is pretty exciting. The music was written by Joseph Scardetta, and he's about to enter graduate school for music composition. And we're like his first job that he got paid for, which is super cool. We've had it for like a while, but we had technical difficulties, so we weren't able to do it today. Welcome to Bibliophilia. As usual, we're sponsored by Sexy Pizza. I'm here today with Kiyomi.
Hello.
We're back to talk about Jane Eyre, but before we do that, we got some feedback, and we want to address it because we like feedback. Feedback is good. Feedback helps us have a better show. And one thing that people brought up was that there's this male voice in the background sometimes, so no one knows who it belongs to. That's our producer, Gabe. He's here. Look, that's him. If you're watching on YouTube, you could see that, but if you're on iTunes, you can't. He's here, and every once in a while he talks, and if
we respond too, so
and if
about us.
I'll talk when I know the book.
He says he'll talk when he knows the book. In the meantime, he's here, and if you hear a muffled male voice, it's probably Gabe. And then the other thing that we got feedback on was our discussion of the plot, because during our first episode, Lolita, we didn't go over the plot at all, and that was problematic. But then for the monk,
all we did was talk about the plot.
Basically we just retold the story of the monk.
The book.
Yeah, and that didn't work either. But one thing that did work was in our second episode on Les Mis, we did a 2-minute plot, and that was really just a joke, because like how do you discuss Les Mis in 2 minutes? But apparently it works, and it makes us think about how we're discussing the book and how we're talking about, like, it makes us think about how to compress it into that amount of time, because we can't just sit here and go over every single thing that happened. Obviously, we have to talk about the bigger themes. So 2-minute plot. Do you want to do a 2-minute plot of Jane Eyre?
Well, I'm the one that's really bad at doing the plot, but I can start and you can cut me off at parts.
I can do a 2-minute.
Because I also didn't read this recently.
Okay.
So I think I'm a lot better at the 2-minute plot because I don't remember all the details as well.
All right. I'm going to set my timer on my phone. I'm not going to make it beep really loud, but I will do a stopwatch. All right. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Go.
Okay. So Jane Eyre is a book written in 5 parts. It starts out with Jane Eyre as a small child, as a dependent of her aunt, where she lives with a wealthy aunt and her cousins who abuse her, and her aunt abuses her. So she eventually gets out of that horrible situation by her aunt sending her off to school. She goes to Lowood, which is a girls' boarding school where the guy that runs it, Brocklehurst, who runs it, likes to starve the girls and make them feel bad about themselves in order to make them godly or better people. Everyone dies in that school. They all get disease.
Well, not everyone. She clearly lives.
Well, it was like 40% at least. 40 to 50% of the people were dead. Then she gets out of there, ends up as a governess at Thornfield Hall. I was really close.
Yeah.
Thornfield Hall, where she meets Rochester, and she falls in love with Rochester. He asks her to marry him. They're going to get married, and then we find out there's a woman in the attic who turns out to be his wife. And so Jane runs away and ends up at Moore.
Oh, she's in the Moors,
Hall.
basically.
She's in the Moors. And she ends up being a charity case of a family that lives there, who we eventually find out are her cousins. We meet Mr. Rivers St. John's, who tries to marry her. She denies him. Things go bad. She eventually leaves because she does not want to marry Rivers, goes back to the mansion, finds out that it had been burnt down, and then she marries Rochester.
Yeah, and that was 1:45. Great job.
Yeah. I missed so much.
Yay. So now that we've gone over that, and that was a pretty good recap, we can talk really about the book. And we're going to start with talking a bit about Charlotte Bronte, because she's the one who wrote the book. And the Brontes there's a family of sisters. So there were actually 5 altogether.
Oh, because of the brother. I was like,
No, 5 sisters, and then the brother. So there was Mary, Elizabeth, Charlotte, Emily, Anne, and then Bronwell is their brother. But when they were young, they went to, the father sent, Mr. Bronte sent the 4 oldest sisters, so everyone but Anne, off to this school. And it was a lot like Lowood, and there was sickness. And Mary and Elizabeth both got incredibly ill of typhus, and they came home but died at home.
tuberculosis.
No, they had typhus, and then the other ones had tuberculosis. Really? Emily,
you keep talking.
Emily and Anne had, and Charlotte all had tuberculosis, but Mary and Elizabeth died of typhus, I believe.
Oh, okay.
And then, yeah, everyone died really young in that family.
And they all died like a year after each other.
Well, Charlotte managed to make it to 39, but that's the oldest.
She's the, yeah.
That was the oldest, and then Emily and Anne both died, I believe, at 29.
Years after each other.
Like Anne died first, so she must have been
years.
28, and then Emily died after her. But the 3 sisters, the 3 surviving sisters, all went on to become authors who wrote these very famous gothic-y novels.
Yeah, it says tuberculosis.
Okay. Well, okay. So they all went on to be these Gothic novelists, and they initially published under the names Acton, Ellis, and Kerr Bell. And Kerr was Charlotte, Acton was Anne. The other one, whose name I just said, was
Kerr Bell. Courier. It was Courier Bell.
Kerr, Acton, Ellis. Ellis Bell was Emily. But then it came out that the books were written by women. Oh, shocker. What a shocker. These majorly feminist books were written by women. So let's kind of discuss how this book is feminist and the journey that Jane Eyre goes on, because she goes on quite a journey for someone who lived in the time.
It's actually pretty funny how I read a lot of the critics' review contemporary of the time, and everyone there was just like, well, this was obviously written by a man. Like, everyone.
There's actually still debate that there are some people who believe that Bronwell wrote all the books by all the Bronte sisters, which is absurd because it's well documented that he was a horrendous alcoholic. So,
and he died pretty young as well.
Yeah, well.
He didn't outlive Charlotte.
Okay,
Pretty sure he died before her.
Okay, we should do more.
Maybe not. Maybe he lived. Actually, he does live longer.
Oh, see, that's what alcohol will do to you.
You will live longer.
It will cure you of tuberculosis, apparently.
Oh.
So, that's not medical advice anyone should take, by the way. No. Oh, actually, there was one thing. If you want to know more about Charlotte Bronte, there's another podcast called the Dead Authors Podcast. And it's comedians who pretend to be authors. And I wouldn't normally recommend it, but the woman who did Charlotte Bronte actually did a fantastic job and did a lot of research. So if you want to know more about Charlotte Bronte, I definitely recommend picking that one up. But she wrote this character, Jane Eyre, who we were talking about.
Starts out poor, young girl. Jane Eyre always started out as an interesting character. She liked to be by herself and reading a lot. And
well, she didn't have much of a choice, did she? Because her sibling, like her cousins, who were stand-ins for siblings, I mean, they were her age. They weren't very nice to her.
Mm-hmm. But one of the feminist things, a theme in feminism is protecting children. And this book really confronted child abuse pretty in your face for, the upper middle class who were reading it, who it was directed towards, which I felt was pretty interesting that I wasn't truly aware of. Because, like, there was Dickens, but Dickens was always, like, the little boys.
I think he was also, he was more kind of after them a bit, wasn't he?
Yes, but it was still about child abuse.
Yeah.
You see the treatment of children in Jane Eyre compared to the treatment of children in Dickens.
And I think a lot of that's to do with like how kind of the poverty. They're at a charity school is what Lowood really is.
Right.
And there's always corruption at these charity schools. Like you saw in Oliver Twist too, the way that people were always trying to like say, oh, here we are, we're treating the orphans a certain way, but they're not being treated well and the money's going elsewhere. And when people find out about this, obviously it causes an uproar.
It's always this idea of keeping the children humble for God. Like that's seems to be like a big theme.
Yeah.
Is humility and purity through suffering, which ends up killing all the children.
And it's so hypocritical, too, in Jane Eyre, because Mr. Brocklehurst's wife and daughter show up at one point, and they're not being very humble.
Yeah, Jane Eyre even points out in her inner monologue, she talks to herself a lot about how, like, Mr. Brocklehurst would not approve of these girls.
Yeah.
And they're his children.
Definitely. And while she's at the school, because one of the things that prompts her to be sent to the school is that she has this outburst that causes her to end up in the red room. But then she like really goes off on her aunt. She's really very passionate. And that's one of the things that I like so much about Jane is that she's very, very passionate. So her aunt's like right before she's sent off to the school, her aunt has made this decision. She's going to go to Lowood. And Jane's basically like, I'll tell everyone how terrible you treated me and I will never love you. And when she gets there, she meets someone named Helen, a young girl named Helen, who kind of teaches her to go more within herself and look within herself for strength. And she doesn't have to like lash out at people. She can bear it. She can bear these difficult moments in her life.
Yeah, so she has to stand on the stool.
Yeah. And I believe Helen tells her it's better to bear a smart, which something I'm paraphrasing because I don't have it up, but it's better to bear a smart which you alone will feel, than to cause a scene and cause pain to lots of other people. And that kind of carries through to later when she gets to Thornfield. And
right, because as a young character, she's passionate, she lashes out a lot. And then as she comes older, I don't want to say she becomes meeker, but she almost becomes quieter, much more reserved.
But she's still very strong, I would argue, that she's still incredibly strong.
She has her religious awakening at some point at school. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's in the book.
Okay.
Basically where she feels more apt to follow God's will.
Yeah. And that really, I think, helps out when she's faced with this challenge of Mr. Rochester.
Oh, my God.
And, yeah, I guess it's kind of interesting to talk about because she is a very passionate person. She kind of contains it, but I think, and it's interesting, there's like an essay in my version talking a bit about the contrast between Helen and Bertha being Mr. Rochester's wife, because Helen's very controlled and within herself, and she dies very young because you have to if you're a good character in a book. Like Beth in Little Women. Why'd she die? She's nice.
Good. She had to,
nice.
Melanie, get rid of her faster.
Melanie in Gone with the Wind, she had to die at the end of the book because she was nice. She was a nice person. So,
we should have gone with the wind.
But one of the essays says that, there's a sharp contrast. There's obviously a sharp contrast between Helen Burns and then Bertha, who's just pure emotion, kind of doing whatever she wants.
Did you mention that Bertha is the wife locked in the attic?
Yeah, she's the wife in the attic.
Just want to make sure listeners know who that is.
Yeah. So she's doing whatever she wants. And after meeting Bertha, because they do meet in a very crazy scene, after meeting Bertha, Jane kind of goes more inside her. It's like she's scared to be passionate because before she's kind of matching Rochester in a lot of ways. I mean, he's a very passionate man, but she is matching him. And then she kind of turns inside herself to the point where when she meets St. John and he's proposing to her, because he really does multiple times and he's very manipulative and he's kind of terrible, but she seems scared to emote to him. She's scared to really express what she feels.
I think that's also, though, because St. John's emotions came from a weird place.
He was very controlled.
He was, yeah. I mean, he was passionate, but really, really reserved. And, like, that wasn't really her scene.
Do you think he's passionate?
Well, he was passionate about his faith and what he wanted to do. Yeah. I don't think he was passionate for Jane at all, obviously. Jane was, like, to him, like, a symbol of suffering.
Yeah.
Like, he did not want to marry Jane to be a partner. He wanted a partner in suffering. That, like, Jane, you are sturdy, but you are plain, and you are ugly, and you are a survivor, so I know you would make me a good partner, but she was just like, that's romantic.
He likes suffering a lot.
He really
like, he doesn't really care about a lot of things, but he seems to really be into the suffering of himself, and he kind of wants to drag Jane along with him.
I think he kind of wanted to fix her because he did see like she was passionate and he wanted to like curb that. Because like that's also, I felt like Rosamund, which was a girl in the village that they lived in who was really, really into into River St. John and wanted to marry him. But I still feel like she was like a strong, independent character. Like she wasn't a wilting flower much as you would suspect from characters in Gothic novels, like the pure girl. I mean, she was still like wealthy, rich, and
yeah.
But I think to him, like she represented temptation.
Yeah, so he chose to be miserable rather than, and he knew that if he married Jane, he'd be kind of. It's not so much that he'd be miserable; he just wouldn't be happy in his relationship, which is sad, and that's something Jane really fights for, that happiness.
Yeah, it's kind of throughout the book you see she's more about the love of another human being, the love of the heart, the love of the spirit, rather than a lot of the men were not Rochester, but there's like this idea of the love of God.
Yeah.
And like a spiritual love, and she's more of the love of the earth and like people and humanity. So you see her kind of consistently sort of turn away from people who are just like, this is for God. And she's like, well, I'd rather, be happy while I'm here.
But I think also that's a big part of what makes this still a strong feminist novel, because it's not, she does want to be happy while she's here, and she wants to love herself. And I think a lot of the time during this time period when Jane Eyre was written, people were using God and religion as a way to keep women down. And she's like, no, I'm going to decide for myself. There's a better judge in yourself than anywhere else, is basically. I'm paraphrasing a lot of these really great quotes here, you guys.
I feel like, I think in the version I have, in the back, there's actually opinions of the press, and it was like of the contemporary time. And one person was just like, this is either written by a man or written by a sexual deviant. So it was like, at the time, like if women felt this way, there was obviously something wrong with them if they didn't want to sit meekly and be subservient to husbands. Because a lot of the literature at that time, and like, because there was a lot of books about this is how you behave as a woman. And I meant to bring in one of mine because it's great and you would love it. But yeah, at that time, they were just telling women, like, you are subservient. Like, your role is to keep your house orderly. Like, that is your God-given talent. Like, you are intelligent. You are intelligent to keep things in order so that when your husband is at home, he is happy. Like, your job is to support everything in his life so that he can, like, support you and make money so that you live in comfort.
So one thing that we see that Jane does, it's kind of different because she is kind of struggling against that idea.
Exactly.
And so one of the things that happens when she first comes to Thornfield, before Mr. Rochester shows up, because he's not there when she first gets here, she goes up to the third floor. She doesn't know that there's a woman behind the walls, but she goes up to the third floor and she paces back and forth and stares out at the landscape and is like, I want to leave. I want to travel and I want to see, because if this is my life, I mean, this is after like a month and a half of employment.
Yeah.
So,
well, the point of leaving
really
Lowood
was
to like travel and like get outside of school and experience life, and then she just ends up in another cage.
Yeah, and that kind of, to me, so Jane's upstairs pacing back and forth, but also when you first see Bertha, you get into the room and she's doing the same thing. So their images, they kind of mirror one another in a way. Do you feel that like Bertha is Jane gone wrong, perhaps?
Yeah, Bertha is definitely an interesting character in like, even in the mind of the author. I think Charlotte kind of feared her in a lot of ways, as in like something that they wanted women to be. She became against that, and then she got stuck in this attic.
Yeah. And I'm not... Yeah, she's a difficult one because she can't live in society. Like, she can't live in she's so outside the norm.
She's
so
society,
outside the norm. When Rochester describes it, first of all, she's Creole, or she's half Creole, which still makes you Creole, I would say. But yeah, they do mention that her mother is Creole and her father wasn't. So first of all, she's got that going for her. Like, the way they describe her is just grotesque. That she's got a purple face and red eyes. And to be fair, it is mentioned that she's an alcoholic, which could cause a purple face and red eyes. And that's the alcoholism led to her downfall. But you kind of have to wonder, like, how much of her life, how much of what we're seeing of her, this alcoholism, is a result of what happened, because she was manipulated too in a lot of ways. Because, I mean, obviously the big thing is that Mr. Rochester was manipulated into marrying her, which is so terrible. He did it because she had money, and they did trick him and kind of lie to him, and no one told him the family history. But at the same time, she was tricked too. Like, you can't.
Yeah, we're kind of in this book, I feel like we're sort of conned to sympathize with Rochester as much as possible. Like, there's the French woman, Adele's mother.
Yeah.
Who he has a relationship, but like she cheated on him and he was so brokenhearted, and then there's this relationship with Bertha where like he was tricked into that relationship and it was so awful, and then like he finally gets what he wants but he loses it all, and like,
well, yeah, because he has a wife.
He has a wife, yeah. So I felt like that was a big flaw in the book, is kind of our push to sympathize with Rochester, to continue to feel bad for him and make excuses for the shit that he continuously does. Are
you allowed to? I feel like we can feel bad for Rochester and feel bad for Bertha, because they're obviously both in a crappy situation that they don't want to be in. And yeah, I just feel like we could feel bad for both of them. And I think that too, that Bertha, it would be unfair to be like, oh, well, he caused her madness by restraining her, because he really didn't, and there was a lot of drinking, and
he didn't really help the situation by locking her in a small room to live the rest of her days with one sole other person to spend time with.
But this is interesting, because while I was reading this book, I did
look
look
up about your research on this.
I did look up what was happening in mental institutions at the time, because it could be completely compassionate for him to lock it.
And that's what Rochester's excuse was, that he wasn't going to send her away.
Well, I think that was really, he didn't want people to find out.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So, well, the one excuse I gave Rochester to sympathize with him, you just shoot down. So I have nothing for him
In the movie, he's like, do you know?
Movie, we're talking about a book.
I know,
Becca.
but in the movie, they're like, do you know what mental institutions are like? But in the book, it's never mentioned. And so, but they were pretty weirdly wrong. So first of all, I found this thing called okay, so there's a few things. First of all, mental institutions kind of did become a place for wayward women. Like, if women were acting difficult outside their place, they would be sent off. That was mental institution. That's how we get the word hysterectomy. It comes from hysteria, which is insane. But that's one thing, that women, it was kind of a place to put women who weren't obeying, or maybe they became spinsters. And so they weren't going to get married. Let's send them off to the...
There's something wrong with them. And I don't want to take care of them anymore.
I don't want to pay for them, so I'll send them off to this state-run hospital. And it was kind of... Okay, so one of the weird things was that they would invite people in to look at them like it was some kind of freak show, which is awful. And then they would ask those people for donations. So they'd be like, okay, come on in to view the freaks, basically, and then give us a donation so we can take care of them. And that care involved all kinds of weird things. First of all, like, one of the things they talk about a lot in the book is physiognomy. Like, and I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. I just read the word the way I thought I should. But basically, it's like the study of the face, the shape of the face, and that decides who you are.
And that was really, really popular.
Yeah, and that would decide a lot what was happening in mental institutions. They would try and bleed people. They would, to get like the bad spirits out, holes in people's heads. And there was this one treatment where they'd put people in a coffin and drop them into water, and then pull them out. And of course their behavior would change, because that's a punishment for bad behavior, but it's not fixing the actual problem. And that was a lot of the treatment. And I think the scariest one, the one I just like, I mean, that's really scary. But one of the ones I found, like, around the time that Jane Eyre was written, a hospital in Utica, and they probably wouldn't have gotten this in England, but a hospital in Utica created something called the Utica crib, where it was like a crib, but it was a crib that was not, it was like a crib with a roof.
It was like coffin size.
Yeah, and all you could do is lay there.
Lidded.
Oh my God, scary. So the attic, in comparison to that, doesn't seem like that bad of a choice. If I had to choose between an attic and like being in a freak show and practically drowned, I would choose the attic.
Okay, you're still just choosing one bad choice over another
I
bad
know,
choice.
but
It's not like...
But it's not like he knew any better. I mean, this is incredibly compassionate for the time. For the time. It's incredible that he chose to
But
do
I
this.
think even Charlotte Bronte felt like this wasn't a compassionate solution.
Yeah, I mean...
So I think even she was saying, like, we're kind of not handling this right.
Well, then Charlotte Bronte needs to go protest in London or something to change the system. But
I think even Charlotte Bronte even mentions at some point that she did not spend enough time on the Bertha character because she didn't care, which is really,
nice.
sad.
She's like, I've got this love story going on and the wife in the attic is getting in the way.
Yeah, Charlotte Bronte confessed that she had shown little concern for the person and predicament of Bertha, but she never confronted the problems of race in Jane Eyre. So, and race was an issue.
It was. If you're really interested in learning more about Bertha, there's another book, Learning More. I mean, it's from someone completely different, but most people consider it a great authority. Jean Reese wrote Why Took SOC, which goes into Bertha's story before she meets Rochester.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and that's a good one.
I mean, it's written in 1966, so
yeah,
it's not contemporary of the time at all, and it's completely like, made up, no connection with Charlotte Bronte whatsoever, but
it is. I mean, it's considered
really
a modern classic, and
it's definitely highly recommended to a lot of students that end up like
taking women's lit classes,
who take women's lit and have to like read Jane Eyre and are
girl.
just like, this is awful, this is terrible. All we're learning about is poor white women, sad white women, and that's why the whites
Why Took SOC
it was so important at the time and now because.
When I took women's lit classes and I had to take them because I was an English major, we never had to read Jane Eyre. We only had to read Why Took SOC. It was just assumed that you would know Jane Eyre. And so they did that with a lot of books. Lolita was one, and like they just assumed that you knew certain books.
And like that happens in all school, like testing and everything.
Yeah.
And there's this assumption that you know
white
this
literature. So let's talk a bit about Mr. Rochester, because it's not just because obviously he's a guy who locked himself in locked his wife in the attic, locked himself. But you don't think you can like sympathize with him? I think he's a very compassionate character, and in the end, he does go to save her, and that's how he ends up blind and without a hand.
I mean,
yeah,
he's definitely a more interesting male character, like just in the genre of Gothic novels, because he's not quite so. I don't know. He's a little bit more interesting where he actually like talks to women. Mm-hmm. Like he has conversations with Jane, whereas you don't really see that so much, where it's mostly men just talking to women. They actually kind of converse somewhat.
Yeah.
Which is nice to see.
Do you think that there are, because I felt like there's a part earlier in the book when Jane first gets to Thornfield Hall, she's talking to Miss Fairfax and she asks, do you like Mr. Rochester? Like, putting aside his land, is he liked for himself? And I think that's, like, to me, that's a big crux of what motivates Rochester, that he wants to be liked for himself. And I think that in that way, he's kind of similar to Jane. He started out as a second son, so he didn't have any money. So he's forced into this marriage. And then all the women that we see, or the people around him, all the women that he surrounds himself with, really, are interested in his money and his fortune. And he doesn't really get to that point where he's like, so he's kind of held by certain constraints in society as well. That Jane, I mean, obviously they're completely different constraints, but in some ways he is held by certain constraints in society.
Yes, but like everyone was held by certain constraints of society. That was like the whole point of that era.
Yeah, but like Mr. Darcy could do whatever he wanted.
I knew
he could do Darcy whatever he wanted.
I was actually thinking in my head like Darcy.
Yeah.
Fuck Darcy.
Darcy could do whatever he wanted. So, yeah, I mean, Rochester, I feel like he's restrained in some ways. But you don't think so, do you?
I mean, he is this wealthy dude that can have any woman that he wants at this point. Yeah, like he was the second son, but now he is no longer the second son. He is the first son.
But they're not. I think the reason he's attracted to Jane is because she does love him for him. She likes talking to him, and she likes being around him, and she doesn't seem, I mean, it sounds so stupid that she doesn't care about his money, but she doesn't seem to care about his money as much as him as a person.
Their whole relationship is confusing to me to begin
Okay,
with.
I used to hate this book. And then on this reading, I cried a lot, and I was like really, really into it. And
I didn't even read it again. I was like, I've read this book 3 times.
Listened to the audio book, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm super familiar with this book already. I just decided to spend more of my time doing research.
Yeah.
On feelings about the book rather than reading the book. So I was like...
All right. So your feelings are that their relationship is screwed up.
Well, yeah. Their relationship is screwed up. I mean, you have to give Rochester points for, like, going under his class and wanting to screw the governess.
But I don't think that's it. I think he really, really genuinely likes her as a person, and I think his alternatives are so mind-numbing.
But does he like her as this person, or does he like her as this idea of a person?
No, because he talks to her a lot. Like, one thing I noticed on this reading when I read through it again, because before I was like, this guy's weird. But on this reading, I definitely noticed that they do have a lot of conversations. They're just not on the page. Jane, the narrator, doesn't feel the need to go into every conversation they've ever had. But there's like a bit of a jocular relationship between them. She feels comfortable with him. It's not a typical employer-employee.
I was just going to say, but he still pays her.
Yeah, but they kind of talk that through. I mean, they talk that through in the first conversation, that he's like, he asked her a question. She's like, do you really care? Because you pay me. Like, most people don't care what their servants think. And he's like, I don't think of you like that.
They had, it just reminded me, I was reading one of their conversations together, and I was just like, there's definitely something weird going on here. Like, if you read it from, like, a totally different perspective, where I came at it from, like, a BDSM perspective for, like, a hot minute in this book, there's this scene where he, like, power plays over her, and they have to come to agreement in their relationship, which is really, I thought, interesting, because he's like, I want to talk to you like this, and, like, I want to be rough with you, I want to push you around, and I want to say these mean things to you. And like, they eventually come to an agreement where, like, that sort of talk to her is okay. And it was really, like, how it was written was kind of fascinating. Like, I know that wasn't really Jane Eyre's or Charlotte Bronte's point.
I think that Jane picks it at Rochester, too. I don't think it's all one way.
No. And I think that's also part of their agreement.
Yeah.
I meant to mark it.
I don't think that this is...
No, I know.
50 Shades of Jane Eyre.
Yes. That's exactly what I was going for on this, because I find that book very good.
Yes.
And a good example of
such
BDSM.
a great novel.
I think you've
American lit.
I think you've heard me rage about it many a times before. So.
Yeah, I think that she plays...
But yeah, I think
it's a weird relationship.
They make the weird relationship work in, like, their weird form of agreements.
Yeah.
Where, like,
I would definitely not suggest starting a relationship with your boss thinking it's going to be anything like this.
Especially one that you live with. Oh, God.
Things can go wrong. For example, he could have a wife in the attic. And then you're out of a job and you're out of love.
And especially if you live during this time and you're a woman without employment.
Yeah, you have nothing.
You have no employment or a husband. You are so screwed, which is how she ended up with Rivers.
She was living outside, and she was
a vagrant for a while.
Yeah, for like 2 days. I mean, it was really kind of lucky and convenient that she happened to meet her cousins in the woods. But yeah, she was living outside, and it was really sad. But I think that speaks to, like, her strength, because she talks about how when the wife is discovered, Rochester's like, listen, go live in France. I will set you up in a house in France, and I will come and be with you every chance you get. We just can't get married right now.
You'll be my mistress.
And
it's going to be all about love, and it's going to be all about sex, and it's going to be awesome.
And she says it's not going to be awesome.
It's not going to be awesome. Because Jane has that moral streak through her. She had that religious awakening, and now...
And
the security of marriage at that time was such a thing that it's just like being a mistress was not a good idea, because if shit went wrong, she would end up on the street again.
Yeah, and she talks about how she thinks as a mistress he's gonna, because the other mistresses he has in the past, and he addresses this during the conversation, which is really funny. He's like, no, they were different, those other ones.
Yeah.
Like, I got over them really quickly, but I wouldn't get over you. Yeah. And she's like, nah, I'm not sure about that.
And I loved how, like, the promise of marriage would just, like, secure her. But it's like, he doesn't have the best track record. P.S.
No, but I think...
It was losing the hand that brought him down,
really. She is so strong. I think this is one part where, like, she is strong because she could have done it. Anyway, she was madly in love with this guy. She wants to be with him. She loves him. She wants to be with him. He's offering her this chance to be with him in some capacity. And it's not just that he'll forget. She's like, oh, that would be shameful. And her thought process is, you know, if she had a family, they would be ashamed of her for going to be a mistress. And she's like, but that's not something that matters because I have no one who cares for me. And then she has this realization, like, I care for me. I care about me. I can't let this happen to myself. This is terrible and degrading to go be someone's mistress when I was going to be his wife. And I think that's, like, where she's really, like, her strongest, like, this weird self-confidence that comes out of nowhere. And it happens to, because in the book, there's this girl that's hanging around, Blanche Ingram, this woman. Oh, yeah. And Mr. Rochester is being really, really kind of lame and, like, oh, yeah, I'm totally into Miss Ingram. I'm going to marry her,
he was basically
Jane.
Flaunting her in front of Jane to make Jane jealous.
And Jane's response is, Blanche Ingram is a basic bitch, and I don't have time for this shit. Like,
she was
awesome.
Actually, I thought it was the saddest part in the book, where she was just like, you are plain, you are poor, you aren't very smart. You are going to go and draw a picture of Blanche in your... Or you're going to go and draw a picture of yourself and leave no detail out and, like, draw this ugly portrait of herself. Well, then she draws this beautiful picture of Blanche, and then she's just supposed to look at them and be like, Blanche is perfect and beautiful. Of course she should marry Rochester, where you are poor and plain, and you deserve this horrible existence in life.
But that's before she meets Blanche. Because she does do that, and she's like, yeah, okay. And for some reason, that, like, makes her feel better in some weird way.
Yeah. Like here, I'm going to just cry a lot.
I can see how this could happen. But then when she meets Blanche, and she's like, repulsive personality, like, her thing is more like, oh, go ahead and marry her, Mr. Rochester. Have fun with that. All right, you're going to be miserable for the rest of your life. Cool beans. You could have had all this.
The governess. Yeah. In her high collars and black clothes.
Yeah, my gray dress that I wear everywhere. Every day. And I don't shower. Well, no one showered, but yeah.
Yeah, that's not fair.
No bathing in Bronte novels.
But they were really into, like, health. But they went at it a bad way by bleeding themselves.
They didn't know. So
and eating hard metals.
So do you think this stands up as a feminist novel?
No. I mean, yes. I mean, okay, obviously the book has feminist themes.
Yeah.
Obviously. For its time, most definitely it was. I think nowadays it doesn't. I don't think it stands up as a feminist novel nowadays.
Would you, if you had a daughter, would you give her this book and be like, here, read this great love story?
I love Jane Eyre.
Mm-hmm.
It is one of my favorite books. I would give it to anybody because I think everyone should read it. But I love the canon of Jane Eyre more than I love Jane Eyre. I love the things that it sparked, and I love the interesting psychology that it sparked. Like, I love Rebecca. Rebecca as a book and Rebecca as a movie is one of my favorites.
You're just talking about me. Thank you. Oh my God.
You are one of my favorites. No, Rebecca. Oh, God.
Daphne du Maurier.
Yes. And
I love it. I love it a lot. And I think, and it is Jane Eyre. The book is just a retelling of Jane Eyre. And then more contemporary is The 13th Tale, which is also another retelling of Jane Eyre, which I also really, really enjoyed. The psychology, the things that, like, the mad woman in the attic, like what that represents and what that started in feminism, I like more than I actually like this book.
Okay.
And for contemporary society, I mean, Jane Eyre is just white. And I think I have a quote written down from someone that wrote, my version is the Clothbound Penguin reissues.
Yeah, those are great books, by the way.
They're really good. They have
I actually have that version, too.
Yeah, you have a lot of versions.
I know. Oh, because it's yeah, you'll see it. If you look on our Facebook page, you can see it. Facebook.com/Bibliophila podcast.
Yes, it's on there. But yeah, there's a couple of articles in it that were written in. One of the quotes I found from that was, modern critics coming to the novel from a... Modern critics coming to the novel from a 21st century perspective query Jane Eyre's sexual and radical politics. Jane Eyre is no longer seen as every woman the subversive outsider, but ultimately endorsing us, the insular English middle classes. It's kind of how I see, and
I guess I could see that.
I really agreed with it.
They don't really address. I mean, like, they don't address.
It's not
the issue of Bertha's otherness, and they don't give her any place. There's no intersectionality in Jane Eyre.
It's another white woman's story, middle class white woman's struggle, where I feel like feminists at this time really, really needs to break away from that, which you see some of it. We're don't see a lot.
Starting to see more integration and stuff like that.
A push to that. And then I have another quote from a Bitch article.
Okay.
Regarding Jean Rye's book, and she wrote, it was Charlie Kalnick, I think is her name, but she's a blogger on Bitch Magazine. Some of her work is up there, but she wrote, why do stories about the beneficiaries of colonialism last through the ages, where the stories of the colonized fall by the wayside if they're even published? Why is the mad woman usually the plot device or the object of pity, not a person? What is so striking about the imaginations of white women, the stories of sane women, that everyone else must be silent? The world is full of Jane Eyres, and wide Sargasso Seas is an astounding exercise as to the wealth of experience missing in the literature held up as iconic, as embodying the experiences of women.
Okay.
And so I found it I always find Bertha's tale more interesting than Jane Eyre's tale.
Yeah.
Where Jane Eyre was poor and plain, and she struggled. She obviously struggled. But whereas Bertha's tale, which is, I find far more interesting how she ended up being placed in an attic.
Yeah. But one thing is, and this is an idea that we continuously had, which I would argue is continuous problem actually, is that there's always this idea like, oh, if we just handle the white women first, the rest will follow, and then people get left behind, like we saw with voting rights and things like that.
Right.
And so that's probably, that's like Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte doesn't spend a lot of time dwelling on otherness that is not white women. And you're right, and these people are right. And then there's also the issue of Jane Eyre actually, she inherits a lot of money at the end, and it's actually slave money. Because her uncle was in Madeira, and they don't talk. They're not like, oh, and it's because of the slaves and that. But the reason that everyone's in Trinidad, the reason that Bertha's from Trinidad, I believe, the Spanish town Jamaica, and the reason that they're down there is for the slave trade.
Right.
That's it. That's how Rochester's making his money. That's how Jane Eyre inherits all this slave money, and it's never discussed. And at this time, I think slavery was ending it was over in Great Britain, but the money was still there. Money was still there because I know, it was ending because I know that in Mansfield Park it becomes it's kind of an issue that they're not discussing the end of it.
It's ended in England.
Yeah,
but England owns colonies everywhere, and in those countries, slavery was well.
Yeah, and it's definitely still happening in the United States. It's
Yes.
not like, so they're getting all this money that's basically off the backs of people of color, and that oppression is never mentioned in the novel. Like, it's the oppression of women, but it's not the oppression of everyone. So
that's why I feel like it no longer stands up as a feminist novel. I mean, it's feminist in a lot of ways, but I don't think we can hold it up today and be like, let's read this feminist novel and get some ideas.
But I think, like, it's still, I could see handing this to, I mean, I think the first time I tried to read it, I was like 11, and I didn't enjoy it that much. But I could see handing it to a teenage girl and being like, think about, and any teenage girl, I'm not saying that they all have to be, I think you're obviously not thinking about slavery on that level when you're 13 years old.
Well, it depends on where you came from.
Yeah. But I think that you can hand it to them and say, look at how strong she is and how much she's guided by her own morality and what that does to her as a character and how that benefits her as a character. And I think that that's positive and that can continue on.
I'm pretty sure I read this book for myself. Actually, I think the first time I read it was this version.
Yeah?
So that's pretty recent.
Yeah.
Within the last couple of years.
Yeah, I was resistant for a long time because I was like, wife in the attic. But it actually, the wife in the attic, it works out, I think. I mean, like, it not in a pod. The story is good, despite the wife in the attic.
Yeah. And there was such a huge canon of it. I was super familiar with this story. You see it so much in a lot of feminist theory.
And definitely because I had to read it twice for women's lit classes, and no one was ever like, wait, back up. Has anyone here read Jane Eyre? Like, no, they just assumed.
It's a common high school thing. I remember my sister reading it, and she made me watch the movie with her, and I was just like, this is awful.
Yeah.
What is happening? Like, I think it's when she came back to Mr. Rochester and took care of him, and she's like, reader, I married him.
Yes.
And I was just like, why?
I cried. What? Okay. This reading, I cried when, and then they have a baby, by the way, audience.
A boy. It was a boy.
And so I'll just go over the ending real fast. But when Jane returns, Thornfield Hall's been burned down, and Mr. Rochester had gone up to the roof because Bertha's on the roof raving mad to get Bertha. She throws herself off. And when he's coming back down, a beam falls on him, and it causes him to go blind. Like, one of his eyes gets poked out, the other one's smoked, and the hand disappears. He lost a hand. And so he's really in terrible shape, but then they get married, and she nurses him, and, like, it's so sweet. His sight starts to come back because, of course, it does. Like,
yeah, the miracles.
When she puts the baby first into his arm, he sees how blue the baby's eyes are.
Just like his. Or something.
I was actually like sobbing. Like, it was very pathetic.
The eyes were black. They weren't blue.
Huh?
The baby's eyes.
I thought they were blue.
No, they're black.
Oh, well. They were beautiful is the story.
Yes, they were beautiful.
It doesn't matter what color they were.
And even though he, like, I think it says in the book, like, he can't see very well, just shadows and stuff.
Yeah.
But he could see the baby's eyes.
Oh, well, his
clearly.
eyesight's get better. Better. And they go to an ophthalmologist.
In London.
Mm-hmm.
I remember.
Pretty fancy. But now they're flush
wealthy,
with money.
Because they have all that slave money.
Yeah. So they've got all the slave money, and they can make all kinds of changes in their life, which is just terrible. And
Bertha's out of the picture.
Yeah, which is convenient, that plot point.
Yeah, what would have happened if she came back and Bertha was still alive?
She'd have to go away for a while and come back again.
She'd just have to wait it out.
Just keep going back and forth. I mean,
keep getting proposed to.
But that's not something that was going to happen because obviously this is literature and this is, I mean, like, what would have happened if Mr. Darcy had been like, meh, I'm bored of this lady, and, like, wandered off, like, it's not how it works. They've got to come back and have things be perfect, and it's not unrequited love unless you're dealing with a Heathcliff Catherine situation, which he comes back and it's not fancy pants for him. It's not a walk in the park, and that is what we're discussing next time.
Heathcliff is
Emily Bronte. What are nights?
Yeah.
That's what we're discussing next time.
No, I know.
Yeah.
But he was dark in complexion, right? And that's where
he's like Asian.
That's where all his problems stemmed from.
Lots of microaggressions in that book.
Not the Bronte sisters and racism.
Yeah, the Brontes had they had a thing with racism a bit, and then also like a thing with men, because if you remember back to the beginning of the episode, that was like almost an hour ago. But try to remember, we discussed that they went off to everyone but Anne went off to this boarding school, and then they write these weird male characters, and Anne does not. Anne writes characters in which
Anne was too young. She didn't end up going to that school because her older sisters died before she went to the school.
Yeah, before she would have been sent off, but she seemed to be fairly well adjusted for Bronte. So
something weird happened at that school.
Yeah, something
besides
really
everyone
messed up.
dying.
And I think they kind of like,
I'm sure living with their brother didn't help.
Yeah, the alcoholic brother. I think it was discussed. I feel like I've read something about it, but it was like really actually, it wasn't just that people were dying. There was like something going on that made it like a really horrific experience for the two older sisters, Jane and Emily. And I know that their father, when he was planning on sending them out, he was having a lot of trouble finding a proper school because like some of the stories that he heard, and this is Lowood, the school she goes to, is really horrifying, but some of the stories that
the school
he
Jane
heard
Eyre goes to,
were worse. Like rats would nibble at children's extremities when the cold got to them, and like
a lot of them were workhouses too.
So terrible. It was better to have those girls being at their house, which was not Wuthering Heights, even though I want to pretend that it is. I want to pretend that's where they lived. All right, so that's our show for today. I think we're going to wrap up, but thank you, Kiyomi, for coming on and discussing Jane Eyre. Next time, we're discussing Wuthering Heights, and then the time after that, we're discussing the Tenant of Wildfell Hall.
Who are you discussing Wuthering Heights with?
Kat Humphries is going to be here to talk about Wuthering Heights, and that should be super fun. I'm excited about that because it's a good one. And then I think you're coming back for Tenant of Wildfell Hall.
Okay.
Springing it on you.
Okay. I went to go try to buy that book. I haven't found it yet.
Yeah, it's hard to find. So I think you can probably find it on like Google Docs or something.
Oh, that's a
Google
good idea.
Books. Just for anybody who's interested, go ahead and find that on
Go ahead
Google
and
Books.
read that before I'm back here.
That's actually considered
it.
the first feminist novel.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so people did not, and Jane Eyre was published first, so people did not consider Jane Eyre like the first. Like now that we've got more time, we consider The Tenant of Wildfell Hall to be the first feminist novel.
Probably because the guy wasn't such a douchebag.
Yeah, well, we'll know there's a douchebag in it that's based on Bronwell. So
the brother?
Yeah. The brother was not winning any favors with his sisters.
I haven't read this one. I'm excited.
I actually haven't either. So
I read Wuthering Heights. I haven't read Tenant.
Yeah, I haven't read it either. So that's going to be kind of interesting that we're both going to come into it with this.
Brand new.
I've never read any Anne Bronte either.
I haven't either.
Because no one likes her.
One, the Grey.
Agnes Grey. People don't like her because it's not tumultuous enough. Like you have to have like that fight, that fire that's in Wuthering Heights that we'll see next time. That you won't be here to talk about it, but Kat and I will talk about the fire.
Yeah, Wuthering Heights is not one of my faves.
I love it.
I don't like it.
I think I've read it like 5 times now. I just every time I read it, I get something else out of it, and I feel like Jane Eyre is going to be another one where every time I read it, I'm going to get something else out of it, and that's so exciting. All right, so reminders: we have a Facebook page that you can like. Facebook.com/Bibliophila podcast. We have a Tumblr. We do have a Tumblr. It's bibliophiliapodcast.tumblr.com. We have a Patreon, patreon.com/Bibliophilia. We have a Twitter, which is Bibliophilia Pod. We have an Instagram, Bibliophilia Podcast. We just have a lot of things.
We like the internet here.
We do like the internet. We're going to collect them into one place, I think. We're going to try and...
In your arms.
Oh, yeah. Like, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see me doing arm motions that indicate how we're going to... But I'm going to try and get a website up and running. No one steal web names because it's really hard to find. Bibliophilia.com belongs to some bookstore that's not called Bibliophilia. So there's that. Anyway, We have all those things. Our sponsor is Sexy Pizza once again. Oh, on Wednesdays, if you're listening this far, if you're in Denver, on Wednesdays from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., you get dollar slices if you buy a drink. And that's a pretty good deal. Can't do it today. Obviously, it's over. But next Wednesday. Do it next Wednesday.
Right before our show. A couple hours before our show.
A couple hours before our show.
But still,
it
you would have had pizza.
And you'll be thinking about that and be really, really happy. So that's that. And then I think we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.